This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. When we, as private citizens, get into an event that involves firearms, and in certain circumstances, we might have to discharge a firearm and injure or kill another citizen, we can pretty much guarantee that the police will investigate that incident. But what happens when law enforcement shoots someone? Who investigates that? And particularly when you add an additional layer, someone that is wanted, someone that is in the national spotlight, someone that the FBI and U.S. Marshals have been searching for weeks upon weeks. Today, we're going to talk about the death of Roy McGrath. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, Mack, so many people, and you hear it over and over and over again nowadays. You hear people say, well, who polices the police? And that's a big question, isn't it? You think about when people are shot, that sort of thing, by the police, who investigates those events. And we've got an interesting case to talk about today. And some people may have heard about it. I had heard about it, but I'd heard about it not from the perspective of this gentleman dying. I'd heard about this gentleman, Roy McGrath, the subject of our conversation today. I'd heard about him absconding with a tremendous amount of money and perhaps trust that may have been misplaced in this particular case.
Joe, as children, we're told, don't tell a lie. You're going to have to keep repeating that lie and other lies to cover up for the original lie. It makes good sense. Thing is, some people don't learn that lesson, and oftentimes they end up in politics. Roy McGrath is somebody who did not learn that lesson, apparently. When Governor Larry Hogan appointed Roy McGrath to be his chief of staff in June of 2020, didn't surprise anybody. They'd been friends and political allies since 1992. Roy McGrath actually was still in college when he worked on the 1992 campaign for Larry Hogan, when Hogan was running against Steny Hoyer for a congressional seat. Now, they lost that election, but they remained friends and could work together over the years. When Larry Hogan became Governor Larry Hogan, he appointed Roy McGrath to head up the Maryland Environmental Service, the MES. It's a job that pays over $230,000 a year. So McGrath heads that up for a couple of years. Larry Hogan needs a new chief of staff. So the governor of Maryland announces that Roy McGrath is his new chief of staff. He begins June 1st, 2020. Nobody's shocked at that. What the shock happened was a couple of months later. Baltimore Sun starts looking into a severance package that Roy McGrath got when he left the MES, the Maryland Environmental Service. Because when you are fired from a job, you oftentimes are given a severance package, but you don't get a severance package when you quit. And yet Roy McGrath received a very healthy severance package, a golden parachute, when he left the MES. And that's what caught the attention of this investigative reporter with the Baltimore Sun. When he got the severance package, he got it by telling the Maryland Environmental Service Board of Directors that the Governor Larry Hogan, approved the severance package. Meanwhile, Roy McGrath is telling the governor the board approved this. It was their decision. A lie. He also had a lot of paperwork and everything else that he fraudulently cooked up to back up his lie. When everything exploded in August of 2020, Governor Larry Hogan accepts Roy McGrath's resignation. He asked for a massive audit of the Maryland Environmental Service, and charges followed. McGrath was charged with embezzlement. He was charged with fraud. He was charged with a number of things and was slated to go to trial in March of 2023. He didn't show up. That's where we are today in this story. As we begin, Roy McGrath is on the run.
Well, it all comes down to this, and I think even Bill Clinton said this a number of years ago. There's an old dog that sits up on a porch and he chases the car for a long, long time. What do you do when you finally catch the car? And that's the position that Roy McGrath was in. He's got the money. Now, what does he do? Going on the lam, I've always wondered what the origin of that term is. I probably ought to look that up, Dave. I'm not really sure because I used to get it confused. I would hear people say going on the lam, and I thought that they were saying going on the land. And I'm thinking, well, that doesn't really make sense. I've heard people say, take it on the heel, take it on the hoof, get out of here, leave, extricate yourself. But either way, you've got a guy that's got a great big target on his back because he's essentially staring, Roy McGrath, that is. He's staring at a failure to appear for a court hearing. And he was supposed to show up, and you decide not to do that. Instead, you decide to blast out of town. And this is not like he's some nobody that can just kind of blend into the scenery. This is a guy that has already been in the news. He's been seen standing at the podium next to pretty high-profile officials.
The governor of the state.
The governor of the state of Maryland. The thought is, how in the world are you going to try to fly under the radar at this point in time? It's quite amazing when you begin to think about, I would think from my perspective, that you're going to do the best you can to try to get out of the country, because other than that, you're going to have the authorities looking for you, Dave.
So Larry Hogan now has this guy he's trusted for over 20 years. He puts him in a position of power, actually two great positions, because Larry Hogan assigned him to the Maryland Environmental Service, a job that paid him a buttload of money. Then he brings him on as chief of staff. Larry Hogan put a lot into this relationship, and Roy McGrath truly benefited. But in the end, Larry Hogan said, well, we're going to have a forensic audit because the Baltimore Sun, the newspaper article came out. So McGrath reads this article and realizes, oh my gosh, they know everything. He didn't know that.
Isn't that something? And that's a trigger point relative to what are you going to do? What is this person going to do now when they're faced with this? And so from the perspective of an investigation, when you're trying to track somebody down, you try to understand what is it in the timeline that they're going to do? What did they do once that information came to them? And that literally that cold cup of coffee hit them. They realized at that moment in time that they're going to have to either turn themselves in and come clean, or get a defense attorney and say nothing, or they're going to have to bolt. And McGrath chose to bolt. And I guess it's the little boy that's still within me. I was a big fan of Marshal Matt Dillon when I used to watch Gunsmoke. And you think about the marshal in town, a U.S. Marshal, but they have the premier fugitive squad that's out there. And of course, the FBI has a fugitive squad as well. And so how are you going to elude these individuals when you're trying, because they have every bit of technology that's out there? And first off, you're going to look at bank accounts. You're going to try to understand, what is this person trying to subsist off of financially? Because you can't use a credit card that has your name on it. If you're going to try to get out of the country and they have flagged you because they know for a fact that you're wanted because you failed to show up now, you're not going to be able to try to bolt out of the country. So you can't buy a ticket necessarily to get out. You can't use your passport because it's been flagged. And so I guess at the end, you think about it, well, you're going to have to pay in cash. And how are you going to convey yourself about? If I was trying to fly under the radar, I don't think I'd go out and buy an Escalade or some high-profile car to try to fly under the radar. But this kind of fits. And as an investigator, you're looking at the profile that this person has, even in the state of flight, if you will. This individual still, by virtue of the fact that we know that he bought this high-end vehicle to try to escape with, he couldn't escape that. He couldn't escape the idea that he was living beyond his means. You had mentioned earlier the idea of a golden parachute. Well, golden parachute is associated with people that essentially leave big companies. You think about CEOs, and that was another part. He wanted to be regarded in this environmental company as a CEO. So now you've got a suspect that views himself as something other than what he is, which is a civil servant that has kind of a quasi-private job that's kind of meld together government and private interest. He's not the CEO of a motor manufacturer. He's not CEO of Kraft.
And Maryland Environmental Service, it was part private, part government. It was a government appointed position. He was appointed it by the governor of the state of Maryland. But he actually, kind of like the whole idea that some people will say that this rich guy was born on third base, but thinks he hit a triple. That's kind of how it became for Roy McGrath. But here's what happened. When he goes on the run, you mentioned on the lam. When he takes off, he was in Florida. He and his wife they bought property in Florida. So he had money from somewhere.
You've got to be specific about where in Florida, because it's not like, look, no offense to my friends in PCB in Panama City. I love going to Panama City. Okay. He's in Naples. I mean, he might as well be that's like the American Riviera down there. I mean, that's where like the really wealthy people go. I've been there before. Here you have this alleged perpetrator at this point in time that has gone on the lam, and he's doing it in a luxury vehicle. And he's also shown up. It's not like he's taking off to Chicago and kind of blending in on the South Side or something. That's not what's going on. It's not like Fugitive, the movie. He's actually in Naples. So you've got somebody that's fitting this profile. And how desperate is he? And from what I understand, McGrath was known to have weapons. And so if that's the case, and the investigators that are trying to track him down already have this awareness that they could be in danger, and some of their agents could be in danger when they're trying to track this guy down as well.
And that's the first thing they did. They go to Naples, Florida. They meet with his wife, and they're like, what was his plan? He didn't show up for his court date today. What was his plan? Because if your plan is to be in court and your plan was to fly, you would have airline ticket, reservation, paid for. All these things would already be done ahead of time. You have to plan to go to court, have to plan on a place to stay. All that would have been arranged. So they show up in Naples, Florida at his $675,000 house the day he's supposed to be in court. He's not there. His wife said, I thought he was flying out this morning. Of course, he didn't. She doesn't know where he is, so she says. And we track him later. He's in the Cadillac Escalade. And the next thing we find out is that, of course, he had no plans of ever being in court. That's important. Roy McGrath had no plans of being in court the day court was in session. He had no plane reservation. He had no vehicle reservation. He had nothing there. Where he did have a plan was to elude. And how he ended up in Knoxville, Tennessee, Joe Scott Morgan, is anybody's guess.
But I do know this. I do know that Roy McGrath pulled into a parking lot and his vehicle was surrounded. He was never going to leave that parking lot alive, either by his own hand or perhaps at the hand of the police. The FBI task force had actually located McGrath and this Escalade vehicle that he's riding around. It's a rather large SUV. It stands out like a sore thumb. They know what he's driving. They have identified this thing just outside of Knoxville, and it's in a parking lot that's shared by both a Costco warehouse store and a Sonic, which is fascinating to me because if he was headed to Costco, you got to have a card, right? If you're going to purchase anything, which is kind of interesting. But when you think about it, all of the people that might be circulating throughout that area, it's in the evening, who could come into harm's way? And they set up a perimeter around him. And from this event, this kind of surrounding him, getting him in a position where they have him corralled. This is where the story takes this incredible turn because from a forensics perspective, this case involves gunfire that it is such a rare thing that you would get an event that would occur like this, that this is the type of scene that after you processed it, after the dust will settle, you would actually write an academic paper about and present it. That's how unusual this is. So just imagine, Dave, you've got this task force that is surrounding his vehicle. He's seated in the driver's seat. They know that he has a weapon. Okay, they being the task force, they're giving him directions. Now, when you think about the police officers or the law enforcement officers, the agents that are standing there, they're kind of creating a perimeter around this thing. He stopped and they're telling him, show your hands. And instead of showing his hands, they can clearly see him take a weapon that he has in his possession and raise it. Okay, now this is all happening in the blink of an eye. And as he raises this weapon in his right hand, he places the muzzle of this weapon to his right temple. So follow me here. He discharges this weapon. Now, to his left, if you think about you're sitting in the driver's seat of a vehicle, there's an agent who has a weapon trained on McGrath. He sees this weapon being raised, and all he can think of is, I am going to be in the direct line of fire, because what a lot of people don't understand is that when you discharge a weapon, even if an individual is discharging this weapon into the right aspect of their head, that bullet can actually travel through the head, through the window of a vehicle, and strike someone that's there. So for this individual to put a weapon to his head and there is a law enforcement officer to the left, that law enforcement officer sees that as a threat. So guess what he's going to try to do? He's going to try to neutralize that threat. And this is where this gets really interesting. At the same time, Roy McGrath began to put pressure on that trigger and began to apply the correct pounds of pressure to actuate that hammer inside that weapon. That FBI agent was raising his weapon and concurrently placing pressure on his trigger. And guess what? These two individuals fired these weapons simultaneously. And it was simultaneously to the point, like I said, the twinkling of an eye. McGrath's round that he discharged into his head entered on the right aspect of the head, traveled across both hemispheres of his brain. Now, the FBI agent fired at McGrath and struck him in the left cheek. And from what we can surmise, the trajectory of this round traveled through the left cheek and actually wound up passing through the cranial vault. Because what's fascinating is that you can see on the passenger side of the vehicle, the passenger window is blown out. You can see the cubed safety glass that is blown out and laying all about, fragmented on the ground. That gives you an indication that there was a projectile that passed through there. One of the problems that they encountered with the McGrath case, and it took several months post-death to try to determine what manner of death this was going to be. Was it going to be a suicide or was it going to be a homicide? These two individuals firing at the same time created two separate wound tracks traveling in opposite directions, which is fascinating when you begin to think about it. And most of the time, when we're dealing with two separate bullet tracks, one of the things that we're looking for is to see if there's indwelling hemorrhage. I'll give you, for instance, if McGrath had fired his weapon and it created a wound track, there would be hemorrhage indwelling in that. Now, after McGrath had fired his weapon, let's just say that the agent fired his weapon after McGrath had ceased to breathe, that he was deceased. There would be no hemorrhage in the wound track. What they wound up discovering in this case is quite the conundrum, because both of these rounds apparently created wound tracks that had indwelling hemorrhage, and both rounds traveled through areas of the head that would be incompatible with life.
All right, so he's going this way, and the bullet from the officer is coming the opposite direction. Is it possible? Two things. Is it possible that those tracks could have crossed?
It is possible, yeah.
As you're dissecting this injury post-mortem, and you're looking at the brain and you're looking at all this and putting it back together. And I'm kind of probably confusing Iron Man and television programming with what I'm envisioning in my head of putting bullets back together and all that. But in reality, doesn't a head wound that becomes fatal, isn't it something that isn't always immediately fatal? I mean, you get a shot to the head and the person's never going to recover from it, but they live a little while, half hour or so.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this, because let me tell you what happens after this. And this kind of further muddies the waters. They grabbed McGrath out of the vehicle, and he's still got what's referred to as agonal respirations, which means his chest it's rising and falling. All right. So it hasn't impacted kind of the primal brain back at our brainstem that functions to regulate the autonomic nervous system. We don't have to think to make our heart beat, right? We don't have to think to breathe. Those are things that naturally occur. So his chest is still rising and falling. His heart is still beating. And you have them taking life-saving measures in order to stabilize him along the way. Now, at some point in time, he probably did arrest, but I'm not saying he was arrested. I'm saying he arrested at some point in time, because they're doing compressions and they're probably putting in an ambu bag, which is the bag that they squeeze to blow oxygen into your lungs. That he actually was pronounced dead at a hospital almost, I think it was right at 27 minutes downrange from when the event actually took place. So they had an ambulance crew, Johnny on the spot there, and they're trying to resuscitate this guy to get him to the hospital. But when an individual sustains this catastrophic kind of injury like this, there's really not a lot of hope for them. And not to mention, you've got two of them. So at the morgue, what's fascinating is that these two gunshot wounds, there's a high probability that the rounds themselves would have fragmented, at least to a minor degree. So the most important thing that we can do is actually take x-rays prior to ever doing the dissection. And it can be quite messy, because you'll have a lot of clotted blood. There'll be blood and brain matter extruding, that's referred to as extruding, from both of these defects. And you might have multiple defects. Here's the thing as well. They haven't fully released the autopsy report yet. And so you can have these extruding. And at the scene, one of the things that we do as investigators, if there's brain matter left at the scene, we have to go out and collect that. People don't think about that, but we actually collect that brain matter and x-ray it many times separately, because what are we looking for? Well, we might be looking for bone fragments, and we might also be looking for little bits of lead that are contained in there, anything that's radio opaque, and we'll try to pick that out. Just imagine any x-ray that you've ever seen. And say, for instance, have you ever seen someone that had an x-ray done and they were wearing a ring, and you see the image? That's radio opaque. When you actually see the ring, that metallic body that's there. It's kind of fascinating when you think about it. But many times when you have these rounds that pass through, they create what's referred to as a lead storm. And you'll see these bits of fragmented lead that are left behind in their trail. And they're there, and you can actually get an idea of the trajectory of the round. It is a bona fide mess when you have two rounds that could be communicating. The tracks actually could be communicating. Or there's so much trauma when you begin to think about the fragmenting bone, because it's not just the round that's passing through there. When that round strikes what's referred to as the external table of the skull is literally fragmented and blown apart. So now you don't just have shrapnel from the projectile itself. Now you've got bone shrapnel. You've got these little bitty sharp pieces of bone that are floating around through the brain as well. And it's very devastating. And I'm sure that probably the round that the FBI was using was probably some type of hollow point round. So if you've got, say, for instance, 40-45 caliber sidearm that they're using, and it's hollow point, if it expands, if the bullet actually expands, because they call it hollow point, it's kind of cupped out in the center. When it expands, you might have a round that might be 40 caliber when it's intact, before it's fired. But if it expands, it can expand out to 50 caliber, because it creates it almost looks like a little mushroom opening up, and it expands, and the purpose of the bullet is to destroy as much tissue as it can. Here's the problem, and this is what was so very curious about the release that the medical examiner made in Roy McGrath's case. they could not make a determination as to how they wanted to rule this. Now, you know that your cause of death is obviously going to be gunshot wound. But, we've only got 5 things to choose from, Dave, as we've talked about on body bags before. We've either got a natural death, we've got accidental deaths, we've got undetermined deaths, or we've got homicide or suicide. And they couldn't make a determination about it. So right now, they have left his manner of death as actually undetermined, which is kind of fascinating. They couldn't settle on an actual manner, how they were going to classify this death. Sooner or later, the autopsy report will in fact be released. And also, the authorities will be compelled at some point in time to make a final determination. An added part to this that many people might not consider is that early on, we talked about on this episode, when a private citizen engages in gunplay, you're going to be investigated by the police. Well, if the police in your local jurisdiction shoot somebody, they will be investigated. They'll probably be investigated by the state police.
And they're going to be investigated to prove that it was a justifiable shooting. Even when you and I look at it and go, it obviously is justifiable, they still have to pull at every nit because they never know who's going to file the lawsuit against them.
Yeah, you're right. But here's the big question, the bigger question. Who investigates the feds when they shoot somebody? And what's fascinating, when you go back and read these reports, the FBI is investigating itself.
I'm really having trouble with the idea that two people, that they're not sitting right next to one another. There is distance. Roy McGrath is holding a gun to his head. They're stippling from the shot. He pulls the trigger. The FBI agent is pulling the trigger on his gun. And we can't determine who did it first?
It would be very difficult to do, I think, because it was apparently a simultaneous event. What I would be fascinated to hear is, was there an open mic out there? I don't know that the feds are necessarily compelled to wear body cams, but I wonder if any of the local police officers were out there. And wouldn't that be fascinating? Even going back to the Kennedy assassination, one of the things that you think about are these acoustic, I think they call them acoustic shadows, where you've got overlapping time. There was an open mic in Dallas that day when Kennedy was shot. You're trying to make sense of these overlapping sounds. And wouldn't that be fascinating to try to explore this? Is there audio that could be kind of taken apart and begin to understand it? I don't know that they're going to go that far with this case. But
when you're expanding and when you're looking at all of this, Joe, and you're trying to put it all back together to explain it in a courtroom, if there is a lawsuit, how do you sit down from a forensic standpoint and say, here, the bullet went this way and exploded out here and took out the back window. Here's the bullet that came from this one. And no, we can't determine which was the fatal shot because they were both fatal.
I would answer your question by saying this, Dave. It's the same thing that my granny taught me when I was little, and that is to tell the truth. Sometimes you have no definitive answer. All you can say is simply, I don't know. And from a scientific standpoint, there's no shame in that. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.